Welcome to Family Revenge Betrayal. Stay tuned, have a fun time, and let's talk in the comments. Let's go.
My parents ditched my grandpa's 81st birthday to toast a bar opening, and I was the only one in his Minneapolis living room when his hands shook over the cake knife. Then my phone lit up with their smiling photos, and then Grandpa whispered one sentence that changed everything tonight. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm not proud of how fast my love turned into something colder, but when you watch your own parents treat a living, breathing human being like an inconvenience, something inside you starts taking notes instead of taking excuses. This happened just outside Minneapolis, in a quiet neighborhood where the houses all look polite and the lawns are trimmed like everyone's pretending nothing ugly ever happens behind closed doors. And that's exactly why what I'm about to tell you still makes my stomach twist. My name is Naomi Pierce, and the night my grandpa turned 81, the only people who showed up for him were me and the silence. No balloons, no family crowd, no cousins arguing over who gets the first slice of cake, none of that. Just a little grocery store cake with blue frosting, a single 81 candle that kept leaning like it wanted to give up too, and my grandpa, Walter, sitting in his worn recliner with his hands shaking so hard the plate rattled against the armrest. You know that sound, right? That small clink that says someone is trying their best to look normal while their body quietly betrays them. His side table was crowded with pill bottles, the kind with the orange caps that don't twist off easily when your fingers are stiff, blood pressure meds, heart meds, something for fluid retention, and a tiny yellow sticky note I recognized immediately because I'd written it for him the week before. Morning pills after coffee, evening pills after supper. He smiled when he saw me walk in, that kind of smile that tries to hide disappointment because he doesn't want you to feel guilty for showing up late even though you're the only one who came at all, and he said, "There she is," like I was the whole party. I set the cake down on the coffee table and I said, "Happy birthday, Grandpa." And he looked at that cake like it was a trophy. The house smelled like old books and Vicks and the faintest hint of soup, like someone had cooked something simple and then forgotten to eat it. I glanced toward the hallway where the family photos were hung, the same ones that never changed. My dad when he was young and cocky, my aunt with her big hair from the 90s, my half-brother grinning like he'd never had a hard day in his life, and Grandpa in every picture standing a little behind them, like the man's whole role was to hold the background together. I asked, casually at first, like I didn't already know the answer, "So they're running late?" Grandpa's eyes flicked to the clock and back to me. He shrugged and said, "Oh, they're busy. People get busy." And it was the way he said it, like he'd practiced saying it, like it was a line he used to protect them and protect himself at the same time. Because if he admitted the truth out loud, that his own son and daughter and grandkid chose a bar opening over his birthday, then it wouldn't just hurt, it would become real. And here's what makes me furious even now. I had called them. I had texted. I had reminded them all week. I even offered to pick them up, bring them over, make it easy because I know how people act when it's not convenient. My dad, Randy, didn't answer my first call. My stepmom, Denise, answered the second one, and I could hear music blasting in the background, that thumping bass that makes people feel young while they act dumb. She laughed into the phone like my question was cute. I said, "Are you guys still coming to Grandpa's?" And she said, "Naomi, we're at the grand opening, it's packed, it's a whole thing," like she was reporting breaking news. I said, "It's his birthday." And she said, "He's old, honey, he'll have another one." And then she laughed again, and in the background I heard my half-brother, Jaden, yell something about free shots and let's go. And then the call cut off like my grandfather's life was just bad reception. I stood there in my kitchen with my phone pressed against my ear after it went dead, staring at my own reflection in the microwave door, and I felt that familiar burn in my cheeks, that mix of humiliation and rage that comes when you realize you're the only one in your family who takes things seriously, and it's not because you're better, it's because you're the only one who actually cares. I drove to Grandpa's with the cake sliding on the passenger seat every time I turned, and I remember gripping the steering wheel too hard because my hands were shaking and I didn't want to cry before I even got there. By the time I walked into his living room, I had already decided I wasn't going to ruin his night with my anger. I was going to be the calm one, the adult, the one who didn't make him feel like a burden. So I put on my smile, I lit the candle, I made a little joke about how the candle was leaning like it needed a nap, and Grandpa chuckled softly, the way older people do when they're trying to be polite, and we sang happy birthday with just two voices, mine loud to fill the room, his thin and breathy, like every syllable took effort. He blew out the candle with a weak puff, and then he looked at me like he wanted to say something heavier, but decided against it. He reached for the knife to cut the cake, and his hand trembled so badly the blade tapped the plate twice. I gently took the knife and said, "I got it." And he didn't argue. He never argues. That's the problem. He's the kind of man who doesn't ask for things because he grew up believing needing people is shameful, and if you're from that generation or you know someone who is, you know exactly what I mean. Their pride can be stronger than their pulse. I cut him a slice, and he held the fork like it was a fragile object, and he said, "This is perfect," like it was a feast. We talked about small things because that's what you do when something big is sitting in the room with you, and you don't want it to speak. We talked about the snow coming early this year, about the Vikings game, about how the neighborhood used to have more kids playing outside, and then Grandpa mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his electric bill had gone up. He said it like it was nothing, like he was talking about the weather, but I noticed the heat was turned down low enough that I kept my coat on. Then he patted my hand and said, "Thank you for coming, sweetheart. You being here means everything." And I swear to you, that sentence hit me harder than any insult my parents had ever thrown at me. Because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was just truth. I sat there and smiled and nodded, and inside my head a different voice said, "Okay. So it's like that now." The night ended quietly. I washed his plate, I wrapped up the leftover cake, I wrote "drink water" on another sticky note because he forgets, and I tucked a blanket around his legs because the house was too cold. Before I left, he stood by the door, leaning slightly, and I watched him pretend he wasn't unsteady. I said, "Call me if you need anything," and he nodded, and then he said, "Drive safe," like my safety mattered more than his loneliness. I got in my car, and I just sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel, staring at his porch light, and I felt something settle in my chest that didn't feel like sadness. It felt like clarity. The next morning is when the real insult arrived, because people like my parents can't just be wrong quietly, they have to be loud about it. I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. Facebook, Instagram, tagged photos, stories. My dad posted a group picture under neon lights, arm around Denise, Jaden holding a drink like he'd won an award, my Aunt Marlene leaning into the frame with that fake, wide smile. The caption said, "Family night at the new spot. Cheers to new beginnings." New beginnings. Like Grandpa's birthday was old news. Denise reposted it with hearts and "best night ever," and my aunt commented, "Wish we could have stayed longer." Jaden posted a slow-motion video of himself dancing with "party mode" in giant letters. I stared at those posts until my eyes hurt. They looked happy, carefree, like the world was a playground and Grandpa was just furniture. And I need you to understand something because I know a lot of you watching this have lived some version of it. It wasn't just that they skipped his birthday. It was that they made sure everyone saw them having fun while doing it. Like the neglect needed witnesses. Like they wanted applause for choosing themselves. I felt that same burn in my cheeks, but this time it wasn't humiliation. It was something sharper. It was the feeling of being done. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and drove straight back to Grandpa's. The roads were quiet, winter light flat and pale, and I kept thinking, if he had a bad night, if he fell, if he needed help, would any of them even know? Or would they just post another smiling picture and say life is busy? When I walked in, he was at the kitchen table sorting through a stack of mail, squinting at envelopes like they were written in another language. One envelope had a red stamp that made my stomach drop. Past due. He saw me and smiled like my presence erased the worry. "You're here early," he said. "Don't you have work?" I said, "I can handle work," and I sat down across from him and slid the envelope a little closer. He tried to cover it with his hand, not dramatically, just instinctively, like a man hiding a bruise. That's when I realized something that made my throat go tight. My grandpa wasn't just being ignored. He was being quietly drained. And the people draining him were the same people posting about new beginnings. Right here, mid-story, I want to ask you something because I'm genuinely curious and I read these comments. Where are you watching from right now? What city and state? Or what country if you're outside the US? Drop it below, because I swear the stories in these comment sections make people feel less alone, and I think a lot of us have been carrying the same kind of family disappointment in silence. Back in that kitchen, Grandpa pushed the mail aside and said, "They've got their lives," and I watched him defend them without even being asked. And something in me snapped, not into chaos but into focus, because I suddenly saw the pattern like it was written on the wall. They show up for parties. They show up for photo ops. They show up when there's something to gain. But they don't show up for the quiet parts. The real parts. The human parts. So I made him tea, and while the kettle warmed I looked around and noticed the little signs people miss when they don't visit. The fridge was too empty for someone who should be eating more. The living room trash had unopened medication info sheets. The thermostat was low, and the stack of mail had more final notices than greeting cards. Grandpa tried to make it light, tried to tell me a story about a neighbor's dog getting loose, and I laughed at the right times, but inside I was already planning. Not revenge like in the movies, not screaming and flipping tables, but the kind of revenge that comes when you stop begging to be respected and you start protecting what matters. Because if my family could choose a bar over Grandpa's birthday, then they could choose to do worse when he got weaker. And I wasn't going to wait around to find out what worse looked like. So I sat across from him, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Grandpa, I want to help you get your papers in order. Not because you're dying tomorrow, but because nobody should be able to swoop in when things get hard and pretend they were there." He blinked at me for a second, like the idea both scared him and relieved him. Then he nodded slowly and said, "I've been meaning to do that." And in that moment, I knew the next few weeks were going to expose everything my parents had been hiding behind their smiles, because once you start opening drawers and folders and old promises, you don't just find paperwork. You find receipts. You find history. You find the truth people have been counting on you never seeing. And then my phone buzzed again. Another post from Denise, another family night photo like they were proud of themselves, and I looked at Grandpa's trembling hands and thought, all right, if they want to treat family like a performance, I'm about to pull the curtain back, and the part they don't realize yet is this. Grandpa has been keeping secrets too, and one of them is about to hit my parents like a slap they can't explain away. I didn't tell Grandpa Walter what I was thinking yet because you don't dump gasoline on someone who's already trying to keep a small fire going inside their chest. So I kept my voice calm, and I made it practical, like this was just boring adult errands and not the beginning of a reckoning, and I said, "We're going to get your documents organized, and then we're going to make sure nobody can swoop in and speak for you when it's convenient." And he nodded like he understood exactly what I meant, even if he didn't want to admit why it mattered. I started coming over 3, sometimes 4 times a week, and I didn't announce it like a hero. I just showed up like it was normal because that's what people who actually care do. They don't make a parade out of loyalty. They just arrive. I'd bring groceries that were easy on his stomach, soups, oatmeal, bananas, the kind of stuff you can eat even when your appetite is low, and I'd refill his pill organizer on Sundays because he kept mixing up the Tuesday and Thursday slots, and I'd wipe down the counters and take out the trash and change the sheets and pretend I wasn't noticing how the house felt colder every week, not just temperature-wise, but in the way a home feels when you realize the only warmth left in it is coming from one person choosing to be there. One afternoon I was in the hallway, and I opened the cabinet drawer he'd mentioned once years ago, the one where he kept important things, and the drawer stuck halfway like it didn't want to open, and I had to tug it, and when it finally slid out, it released that smell of old paper and dust and something metallic like pennies, and inside were folders with labels in Grandpa's neat handwriting. And just seeing those names made my stomach tighten because they weren't random, they were family. Names like a quiet record of who had been taking and taking for years. There was one for Randy, my dad, one for Marlene, my aunt, and one that just said house in block letters. I pulled out the folder with my dad's name first, and the top paper wasn't sentimental. It wasn't a photo or a letter, it was a loan agreement, dated 8 years back, and the amount was so clean and obvious it almost looked fake. $50,000. I sat down right there on the hallway bench, and I read it twice because my brain didn't want to accept it. Grandpa had lent my dad $50,000 to start a contracting business, and beneath it were scribbled payment notes, Months and months of partial repayments that slowed down, then stopped, and then there were more papers showing Grandpa covering expenses anyway, like he was trying to keep the dream alive even after my dad had already moved on to the next shiny thing. I flipped to another page and saw a handwritten note from Grandpa that made my throat sting. Randy said it's temporary. He'll make it right. Temporary. That word is how people like my dad survive their own conscience. I put that paper back and opened Marlene's folder and found invoices for roof repairs after a storm, $28,000, paid by Grandpa, and then a hospital bill copay, then a car repair, then something that looked like a down payment assistance check. And it hit me like a cold wave that my grandpa had been the family safety net for decades, not because he was rich, but because he was responsible. And everyone else confused responsibility with endless supply. I carried the folders into the living room and set them on the coffee table like I was placing evidence in front of a jury, and Grandpa looked up from his recliner with that gentle confusion older people get when you move too fast around their routines, and he said, "What's all that, sweetheart?" And I didn't even know how to answer without my voice cracking, so I went simple and honest. I said, "It's the stuff you've done for them." He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his hands shaking a bit, and he scanned the top page and his mouth pressed into a thin line like he was embarrassed for himself, not for them, and he said, "Well, yes, that was when Randy needed a boost." And he said it like it was a normal thing, like a parent handing a child a lunchbox. And I felt my jaw tighten because I could picture my dad acting like a big man at a bar while Grandpa was clipping coupons and stretching prescriptions. I asked Grandpa, carefully, "Are you behind on anything?" And he hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. And then he said, softly, "Utilities went up." And then he tried to laugh like it was silly. And then he admitted, "And I've been spacing my medication a bit to make it last." That's when the calm part of me disappeared. Not outwardly, I didn't start yelling, but inside, something in me went very quiet and very sharp, because skipping heart medication so your kids can post champagne photos is not a family issue, it's moral rot. I sat on the edge of the couch and I said, "Grandpa, you can't do that." And he looked away and said, "I don't want to bother anyone." And I almost laughed because the idea of him bothering them was insane when they'd bothered him for years with their hands out. That's when he did something I didn't expect. He looked at me for a long moment, and his eyes got clearer, like he'd finally decided he was done pretending, and he said, "I see how they treat you too." And that sentence hit me harder than the bills, because it meant he'd been watching my whole life. He'd seen my stepmom Denise put Jaden first in every little way, the front seat, the extra money, the new shoes, the casual way my birthdays got treated like optional plans, and he'd seen my dad go along with it because it was easier to be liked by the loud people than to defend the quiet child who just wanted to be valued. Grandpa's voice stayed soft, but it got steady, and he said, "They come around when they need something, and they disappear when you need them, and that's not right." Then he reached over and patted my hand and said, "You've been here. You've been the one showing up. That matters." And right then, I understood what the story was really about. It wasn't about a birthday cake. It was about who shows up when there's nothing to gain. It was about who treats love like a contract and who treats it like a coupon they can redeem whenever they feel like it. So I told Grandpa, "We're going to see a lawyer," and he didn't argue. He just nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to give him permission to protect himself. I looked up the attorney he'd used years ago, a man named Martin Keller, and when I called, the receptionist asked a bunch of normal questions like it was just paperwork, and I booked the earliest appointment I could get. And when I hung up, Grandpa said, "You don't have to do all this." And I said, "I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because I'm not letting you be used anymore." He blinked like he was absorbing the idea that someone was choosing him without conditions. The week before the appointment, the family kept posting. Denise posted another great night photo like she was collecting trophies. My dad reposted it with some stupid, blessed caption, and Jaden uploaded a video of himself trying a new drink like he was a food critic, and I watched those posts while sitting at Grandpa's kitchen table, staring at an overdue utility bill, and I thought, they don't even know what they're standing on. They don't know the foundation under them is a man they keep ignoring. And then something else happened, something small but telling. My dad finally called, not to ask about Grandpa, not to ask how he was feeling, but to ask if Grandpa had mentioned anything about paperwork. That's when I realized the letter hadn't even been sent yet, and they were already sniffing around. I kept my voice neutral and I said, "What paperwork?" And my dad did that fake chuckle he does when he's caught, and he said, "Oh, nothing, just checking in." And then he quickly pivoted into complaining about money, how everything costs more now, how people don't understand how hard it is, and I listened, and I said almost nothing because the pattern was too clear to argue with. He didn't call because he missed Grandpa. He called because he sensed control slipping. And then the day of the appointment came. I picked Grandpa up in my car, and he wore his best jacket like he was going to church, and on the drive downtown, he kept looking out the window quietly, like he was watching his life pass in storefronts and stoplights, and he said, "I didn't think it would come to this." And I said, "It came to this a long time ago, you just didn't want to admit it." And he nodded slowly because deep down he knew. Martin Keller's office was in a plain building with dark wood trim and a waiting room that smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long, and Grandpa sat carefully, hands folded, while I filled out forms, and I could feel his pride fighting his reality the whole time. When Martin finally called us in, he was polite and calm in that lawyer way, and he asked Grandpa what he wanted, and Grandpa's voice didn't shake this time when he said it. He said he wanted to make sure the house, his small cabin up north, and his savings were protected, and he wanted to make sure the person who had actually been there, me, was the one who could keep things stable. Martin explained options, wills, trusts, beneficiaries, and I watched Grandpa's face tighten when Martin said the words contest and challenge, because Grandpa knew his kids. He knew exactly how they'd behave the moment money was threatened. Grandpa asked, "Can they fight it?" And Martin said, "They can try." And then Martin explained how an irrevocable trust could lock it down, how titles could be transferred, how distributions could be structured, and Grandpa looked at me, and I could see the fear behind his eyes. Fear of causing family conflict, fear of being called cruel, fear of being the bad guy in his own story, and I leaned forward and said, "Grandpa, they already chose. They chose the bar. They chose the photos. They chose themselves. You're not causing conflict by protecting what you built. You're just finally admitting what's real." Grandpa swallowed, and then he nodded and he said, "Do it." Martin's pen started moving. Paper slid across the table. Grandpa signed slowly, deliberately, like he was signing his name on the truth. And here's the part that still makes my skin prickle. As we were standing to leave, Martin said almost casually, "Once the filings go through, your family will be notified." Grandpa's hand paused on the chair back. Notified. And in that single word, I could already hear my stepmom's voice rising, my dad's anger, my aunt's excuses, Jaden's entitled whining, because people who treat love like convenience don't accept boundaries quietly. On the drive home, Grandpa stared out the window and whispered, "I feel lighter." And I didn't say it out loud, but I thought, you feel lighter because you finally stopped carrying people who refuse to walk beside you. That night I stayed late at Grandpa's, helped him into bed, set water by the bedside, and as I turned off the lamp, my phone buzzed with a new notification, and it was Denise posting again, laughing under neon lights, and the caption said, "Only good vibes," and I just stood there in the dark hallway and smiled, because the good vibes were about to collide with something they can't laugh off, and the moment Martin's letter hits their mailbox, they're going to come running like they always do. But this time they won't be coming for Grandpa's health. They'll be coming for what they think belongs to them. And they'll walk through that front door acting offended like victims, and Grandpa will finally see their love for what it is, and I'll finally get to say the sentence I've been holding back since that birthday candle leaned and almost fell over. The sentence that changes everything when you say it out loud. You don't get to ignore someone for years and then inherit their life like you earned it. The letter didn't arrive with fireworks or sirens. It arrived the way real consequences usually do. Quietly in a plain envelope, with a return address that screamed law office and nothing else, and the moment Martin Keller's assistant dropped it in the mail, the entire family dynamic shifted without them even realizing why, like the air pressure changed before a storm. Grandpa Walter didn't celebrate, he didn't smile, he just kept watching the mailbox like he was waiting for something he'd been dreading and wanting at the same time, and I'll be honest with you, that week felt like living with a ticking clock in the kitchen. The trust was filed, the deeds were being retitled, the accounts were being moved, and all the little protections were locking into place, and the only thing left was the reaction. Because people like my dad and Denise don't respond to boundaries like normal humans, they respond like you stole something from them, even when it was never theirs. The first call came 3 days later. Not from Grandpa's phone, from mine, because of course it did, and the screen lit up with my dad's name like a warning label, and when I answered, he didn't say hello. He didn't ask how Grandpa was doing. He jumped straight into the only thing that matters to people who treat family like a vending machine. He said, "What the hell did you do?" And I could hear Denise in the background, laughing in that sharp fake way like she was already rehearsing her outrage, and I said, "If you're talking about Grandpa's estate plan, you should talk to Grandpa." And my dad snapped, "Don't play games. He'd never do this without you pushing him." And there it was, the exact accusation they always use when they're losing control. They can't imagine Grandpa has agency. They can't imagine he made a decision based on what he saw, so they blame the closest villain available. I kept my voice calm because anger is what they feed on, and I said, "You got a letter, right?" And my dad said, "Yes, we got a letter, and it says we're basically cut out." And then Denise's voice slid in, syrupy and cruel. "It's embarrassing, you know, to be treated like strangers by your own father." And I actually laughed once, just a short breath, because that statement was so backwards I couldn't help it. And then my dad said, "We're coming over," like it wasn't a request, like he still owned the house by sheer entitlement. They arrived that Saturday like an invasion, 2 cars pulling up close to the driveway, doors slamming, footsteps heavy on the porch, and I watched through the living room window as my dad marched up with that clenched jaw face, Denise right behind him with her arms crossed, and my half-brother Cody trailing like he'd been dragged there and wanted to disappear. I opened the door before they could ring the bell because I didn't want Grandpa startled by the sudden noise, and my dad stepped inside without waiting, looking around like he was inspecting his childhood home, and he said, loud enough for Grandpa to hear, "Dad, this is ridiculous." And Grandpa didn't flinch. He just sat in his recliner with a blanket over his knees, hands folded, the pill bottles on the side table like quiet witnesses. Denise put on her sweet voice first, the one she uses in public, and she said, "Walter, honey, we're worried about you. We heard you made some changes." And Grandpa looked at her and said calmly, "You heard right." And my dad cut in, "You can't just remove us. We're family." And I watched Grandpa's face do something subtle. Not anger, not sadness, just a tired clarity, like he'd finally stopped pretending that the word family means the same thing to everyone. Grandpa said, "Family shows up," and my dad's nostrils flared like he'd been insulted, and he tried the excuse that always works on people who still crave approval. He said, "We're busy, Dad. Life is busy." And Grandpa nodded once and said, "Busy is a choice," and Denise scoffed, "Oh, come on, one missed birthday, and now you're rewriting history." And that's when Grandpa finally looked straight at them and said, "It wasn't one birthday, it was years." And the room went still in that way it does, when the truth is spoken out loud and nobody can deny it without sounding insane. My dad started pacing because he can't handle being pinned down by facts, and he said, "This is Chelsea's doing," pointing at me like I was a criminal, and I didn't even respond right away. I just looked at him like, "Are you seriously doing this in front of the man you ignored?" And then I said, "Dad, when was the last time you refilled Grandpa's prescriptions?" And he blinked, and then he said, "That's not the point." And I said, "When was the last time you drove him to a doctor appointment?" And he snapped, "We have jobs." And I said, "When was the last time you sat with him in this room for an hour without asking for anything?" And he went quiet, because silence is what happens when you corner someone with their own absence. Denise tried to switch tactics. She turned to Grandpa and said, "Walter, this isn't you, you're being influenced." And Grandpa's voice stayed soft, but it sharpened on the edges. He said, "I'm being informed." And then he pointed at the folder on the coffee table, the same one I'd found, and he said, "I'm informed by receipts." And my dad's face changed because he recognized those papers. He recognized the loan, the old agreement he never honored, and for a second, just a second, I saw embarrassment, and then it got buried under anger because shame is painful and anger is easier. Grandpa continued, "I helped you when you asked. I helped Marlene when she asked. I helped everybody when they asked, and now I'm cutting pills in half to stretch them, and you're too busy to notice." And Denise opened her mouth, but Grandpa lifted his hand slightly and said, "No, Denise, don't talk over me in my house. And I swear to you, That was the first time I'd ever heard him speak to her like that. And it hit Denise like a slap because she's used to dominating every room she enters. My dad switched to guilt. So you're punishing us. And Grandpa said, I'm protecting myself. And my dad shot back. From what? Your own son? And Grandpa looked him in the eye and said, from being used. And that sentence landed like a brick. Now I want to ask you something right here because I know people have strong opinions about this. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Because I want to know if this kind of family drama is universal or if it hits different depending on where you grew up. Drop it in the comments. And while you're at it, tell me this. Did my parents cross a line by showing up angry about money instead of checking on Grandpa's health? Because I promise you, their next move was even uglier. Denise finally snapped and dropped the concerned act. She said, so what? You're giving everything to Chelsea because she baked a cake. And I said, no, he's protecting what he is because you treated him like an afterthought. And my dad glared at me and said, you're dividing the family. And I said, no, Dad, I'm revealing it. And Cody, my half-brother, shifted in place like he wanted to melt into the wall, and he muttered, we were going to come by more. And Grandpa didn't yell, he just said, promises don't warm a house. And it was such a clean line that even my dad had nothing ready for it. Then my dad did what he always does when he can't win morally. He tried to win legally. He said, we'll contest it. And Grandpa nodded like he expected that, and he said, you can try. And then Denise leaned in and said, you're going to die alone if you do this. And I felt my hands curl because that's not an argument. That's a threat. And Grandpa's eyes narrowed and he said, I'm not alone. And he gestured toward me without even looking, and that moment, that simple gesture, was worth more than any inheritance. They left without hugging him, without asking how he was feeling, without offering to help. They just stormed out as if they'd been wronged, and when the door shut, the house didn't feel sad. It felt clean, like someone finally opened a window and let the stale air out. Grandpa sat there for a long time after, staring at the blank TV screen, and then he said quietly, I didn't want it to be like this. And I said, I know. And he nodded and said, but I'm tired of being the wallet and the wallpaper. And I sat beside him and I said, you're not. And he patted my hand once, small and steady, and then he said, they'll come back. And I said, I know. And he said, not for me. And that's when the Real story started to turn, because the next week, the consequences began showing up in places nobody could hide from. My dad's business partner called Grandpa, not to check on him, but to ask if Grandpa could help bridge a shortfall, because apparently my dad had been counting on Grandpa's quiet support even after years of neglect. And Grandpa looked at the phone like it was a snake and handed it to me, and I told the man politely, no. And when I hung up, Grandpa exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for years. Then Marlene, my aunt, sent a long email about family duty and respect, and she attached pictures of the cabin up north like it was some sentimental argument. And I recognized the manipulation instantly, because when people can't win with love, they try to win with nostalgia, and Grandpa didn't even open the attachment. He just said, funny how respect shows up only when money is leaving. And I nodded, because that's exactly it. And then, late one night, my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't my dad, it was Denise, and her message was short and cold. You think you've won, but you don't know what you started. And I stared at that text and felt a chill, because that wasn't a plea, that was a promise. And I realized right then this wasn't going to be a simple family fallout. This was going to turn into a full-blown campaign, because people who live off control don't just accept a locked door, they look for a window, and the very next morning, I found out exactly what window they planned to climb through. The window they chose wasn't a metaphor, it was a real one, and it came dressed up as concern, because when manipulators can't bully you, they weaponize institutions, and the next morning proved it. I woke up early, drove to Grandpa Walter's place like I always did, coffee in one hand, grocery bag in the other, and when I pulled into the driveway, there was already a sedan parked at the curb that didn't belong to any neighbor, and my stomach did that slow, sinking thing where your body knows before your brain catches up. I stepped out, and I saw two people on the porch, one in a plain navy jacket holding a clipboard, the other in a windbreaker with a county logo on the chest, and they weren't smiling. The woman with the clipboard introduced herself like she was reading from a script, Adult Protective Services, We received a report that Mr. Walter Carter may be the victim of financial exploitation, and the words hit my ears like ice water, because in one sentence, Denise had flipped the whole story. She took Grandpa's boundaries and turned them into a crime scene with me as the suspect. I didn't panic, I didn't argue. I did the one thing people rarely do in these moments. I got quiet and listened, because I've learned something about people who operate like my parents. They count on you getting emotional. They count on you sounding unstable, because instability is the story they're trying to sell. I opened the door, let them in, and Grandpa was in his recliner, blanket on his knees, the morning news on low volume, and when he saw them he frowned, not confused, just irritated, like he already understood what this was. "Walter," the man said gently, "we're here to make sure you're safe." And Grandpa's eyes flicked to me, and he said, "Safe from what, exactly?" And the woman's tone stayed soft but firm. "We've been told someone close to you pressured you into signing documents and changed your estate plan." And Grandpa gave a short breath like a laugh with no humor. "Someone close to me?" And then he looked right at them and said, "My own son is the one who pressured me for money for years, and now that I finally said no, he's calling the government." The woman glanced down at her clipboard and she asked, "Did you make the trust changes voluntarily?" And Grandpa answered without hesitation, "Yes." And she asked, "Do you understand what you signed?" And Grandpa leaned forward slightly, voice stronger than I'd heard in weeks. "I understand it better than my son ever understood me." And the man in the windbreaker nodded once, like he'd heard that sentence before from other older people who got treated like furniture. They asked Grandpa a series of questions, the kind designed to catch confusion. Name the date, name the president, explain the decision, and Grandpa answered every one cleanly, steady, no wavering, and I watched their posture soften, not because they were on my side, but because the facts were refusing to cooperate with the accusation. Then the woman asked to speak with Grandpa alone, and I said, "Of course," and I stepped into the kitchen, but I kept my ears open because I was not about to let my parents twist words in private and then claim Grandpa admitted things he didn't say. I made tea, hands steady, and I stared at the pill bottles lined on the counter, and I thought about how disgusting it was that the first time my father had mobilized any help for Grandpa in years, it was to punish him for choosing the wrong beneficiary. 10 minutes later, the woman called me back into the living room and she said, "Mr. Carter appears competent and consistent." And Grandpa said flatly, "You can put that in big letters." And then the man asked me if I had documentation of my caregiving, and I didn't even blink. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd started weeks ago. Dates of doctor appointments, pharmacy pickup receipts, texts from my dad that never asked about Grandpa's health, and a photo I'd taken of the overdue utility notice on Grandpa's table, because I had a feeling this would turn into something ugly, and I wanted a paper trail. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly when she saw the timeline, and she said, "It's clear you've been present." And I said, "I'm not trying to win a contest. I'm trying to keep him safe." And Grandpa added, "The people who reported this haven't been in this house in months." And the room went quiet again, because when you put truth next to a lie, the lie starts sweating. They left after giving Grandpa their card, not hostile, just professional, and as soon as the door shut, Grandpa's hands trembled slightly, not fear, anger, the kind of anger older people swallow because they're tired of being treated like children. He said, "Your father did this," and I said, "Yes," and he stared at the blank TV screen and said, "That boy would rather label me incompetent than admit he abandoned me," and I sat beside him and said, "He's not going to stop," and Grandpa's jaw tightened. "Then neither am I." That afternoon, I called Martin Keller, Grandpa's attorney, and I told him exactly what happened, and he didn't sound surprised. He sounded annoyed in that calm lawyer way, and he said, "They're laying groundwork," and I said, "For what?" And he said, "Contest, guardianship petitions, smear campaigns, sometimes all of it." And when he said guardianship, my blood ran cold, because that's the nuclear option. That's the legal version of kidnapping someone's autonomy and handing it to the person who wants control. Martin told me, "We need to harden everything." And he walked me through it like a checklist: medical evaluation documenting capacity, notarized affidavit from Grandpa stating his intent, video recording of Grandpa explaining why he made changes, and a letter to the file noting coercion attempts by family members, because when people like my dad lose access to money, they start trying to win access to the person, and Grandpa's personhood becomes the new asset. We scheduled a capacity evaluation with Grandpa's primary doctor for the next day, and I drove him myself, and in the exam room, while Grandpa sat on that crinkly paper with his coat folded on his lap, the doctor asked him the same type of questions again, and Grandpa answered them with a weary patience, and then he looked at the doctor and said, "I can name every grandchild's birthday and every bill I've paid on time, but my son thinks I'm confused because I finally stopped paying his," and the doctor's face hardened just enough to show he understood the game. The doctor wrote a detailed note, not just alert and oriented, but specifics, comprehension, reasoning, consistency, and when we left, Grandpa squeezed the paper in his hand like it was armor. On the drive home, Grandpa was quiet, and then he said something that made my throat tighten. He said, "Do you know what it feels like, Chelsea, to have your own child try to take your mind away?" And I kept my eyes on the road and said, "I can imagine." And he said, "It's like being buried while you're still breathing." That night, I got another text from Denise, and it wasn't subtle anymore. It said, "They're asking questions because people are worried. Maybe you should stop before you make this worse." And I stared at the screen and felt that same cold clarity I felt the morning of the APS visit, because this was no longer about Grandpa's birthday. This was about power, and Denise was basically admitting she'd called them. I didn't respond. I screenshotted it, saved it, and forwarded it to Martin, and he replied within minutes. "Good. Keep everything." The next move came faster than I expected, and it came from a place I didn't even think to defend: church. Grandpa had gone to the same small Lutheran church for decades, the kind where everyone knows your name and your casserole preference, and I thought that was one safe corner of his life my parents couldn't poison, but I was wrong. The following Sunday, I walked in with Grandpa, slow steps, his hand on my elbow, and I could feel eyes on us immediately, not the normal friendly eyes, the curious ones, the ones that say, "I heard something." After service, Pastor Reynolds pulled me aside with a gentle face and said, "Chelsea, can we talk?" And my chest tightened, because gentle faces can still carry sharp news. He said, "Daniel came by this week. Daniel being my father. He's concerned about Walter." And I said, "Concerned enough to finally visit." And the pastor hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. He said, "He mentioned there may be disagreements about finances," and I said, "He stole Grandpa's time for years and now wants to steal his choices." And the pastor flinched slightly, not because I was wrong, but because I said it too plainly for polite church air. Then he said, he asked if the church could encourage Walter to seek guidance and maybe appoint someone to help manage things. And there it was again, the theme: strip Grandpa of agency, dress it as help. I looked the pastor dead in the eye and said, "If you want to help Walter, ask my father why he skipped his birthday to go drink under neon lights." And the pastor went quiet, because he hadn't heard that part. And why would he? My father only tells the version where he's the victim. I went back to Grandpa, and I didn't tell him immediately, because I didn't want him carrying fresh humiliation in a place that used to feel safe. But Grandpa noticed anyway. He always notices, and when we got into the car he said, "They're talking," and I said, "Yes," and he stared out the window and said, "Let them." And then he turned to me, eyes clear. He said, "Chelsea, promise me something." And I said, "What?" And he said, "If they try to take me, don't let them do it quietly." That sentence sat in the car like smoke, heavy and real. And that's when I realized the window wasn't just APS or church whispers. The real window was public perception. They were trying to paint me as the greedy granddaughter and Grandpa as the confused old man, because if they win the story, they can win the court, and if they win the court, they can win everything. That same evening, I opened Facebook and saw the first post. My dad had written a long, syrupy paragraph about elder abuse awareness and protecting seniors from manipulation, and he didn't name me, but he didn't have to, because Aunt Marlene had already commented, "Some people will do anything for money," and Denise added a sad face emoji, like she was watching a tragedy, and I felt my hands go cold, because now it wasn't just a family argument, it was a campaign. I walked into the living room, showed Grandpa the post, and I watched something change in his face. Not heartbreak, resolve, and he said, "Okay, just one word," and then he said, "Call Martin." And when I asked why, he looked at me and said, "Because if they want to lie in public, then we're going to tell the truth in public." And right then, my phone buzzed with a new notification, a message request from a local reporter I didn't know. And the first line said, "Hi, I'm hearing concerns about an elderly man being exploited by a family member. Can you comment?" And my stomach dropped because my parents hadn't just opened a window, they'd opened the whole front door, and the next 24 hours were about to decide whether Grandpa's truth survived their story. The reporter message felt like somebody had reached through the screen and grabbed my throat because once outsiders get involved, your family stops being messy and starts being a narrative, and my parents were already writing mine for me. I didn't answer right away, not because I was scared, but because I knew exactly what they were trying to do. Bait me into a sloppy reaction, clip it, twist it, and then parade it around like proof. Grandpa Walter was sitting in his recliner, hands folded, eyes on my face, and he didn't ask what the message said because he already knew it was bad. He just said, "They finally found a microphone," and the way he said it, quiet and flat, made my stomach turn because it told me he'd seen this pattern before, maybe not with social media, but with how certain people weaponize community gossip. I called Martin Keller immediately, and he picked up like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Do not respond on the record until we control the documents," he said, and then he added, "And control the video." And I said, "Video?" And he said, "We record Walter, clean audio, calm setting, him stating his intent in his own words, and we do it before they try a guardianship move." And guardianship again made my skin prickle, because that word sounds like protection until it's used like handcuffs. We set it up that night in Grandpa's living room. Not some dramatic setup, just real life. The lamp on, the TV off, the pill bottles in the background like quiet witnesses, and Grandpa in his favorite chair with his blanket folded neatly, because he wanted to look like himself, not like a victim. I pressed record and Martin coached from speakerphone, asking simple questions that sounded almost boring but were legally lethal. State your full name. What day is it? Why did you change your estate plan? Did anyone pressure you? Grandpa answered slow and clear, and I watched him become sharper with every sentence, like saying the truth out loud was giving him oxygen. Then Martin said, "Walter, why are you concerned about your son's actions right now?" And Grandpa paused, not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to say the next part, because the next part was going to break the last illusion that his son was still a decent man under the selfishness. Grandpa looked into the camera and said, "Because my son doesn't miss me. He misses my money." And my throat tightened so hard it hurt. He kept going, and he didn't raise his voice once, which somehow made it more brutal. "They skipped my birthday for a bar opening, and they didn't call to apologize. They called a lawyer when they realized they were cut out." And then his jaw tightened and he added, "And now they're telling people my granddaughter is exploiting me, when she's the only one who has been here when I couldn't stand up without help." I ended the recording, and for a second, neither of us moved, and then Grandpa said, "Now it's real." And I said, "It was real the day they didn't show up," and he nodded once like that was the line in the sand. The next morning, the first thing I did was open Dad's Facebook post again, and the comments had multiplied overnight like mold. People I'd known my whole life, people who'd never brought Grandpa soup, never refilled his prescriptions, never sat beside him while he stared at the floor trying to remember if he'd already taken his meds, were suddenly experts in elder exploitation. One woman wrote, "These young people have no respect," and I actually laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because the hypocrisy was so thick it felt like satire. Respect, to them, meant obedience. Respect meant letting the older generation be drained quietly, so the people doing the draining could keep calling themselves good family. Then the reporter followed up, polite but persistent. "We're hearing your parents are worried, and there may be legal filings. Can you confirm?" And it clicked in my head that this wasn't just gossip, it was a coordinated squeeze. Public pressure plus legal threat. That's how you make an older person doubt themselves. You flood the room with noise until the truth feels like the minority opinion. I showed Grandpa the messages, and he didn't flinch. He said, "Bring them." And I said, "They're trying to embarrass you." And he said, "They embarrassed themselves when they left me alone with candles and silence." That afternoon, Dad escalated, because of course he did. He showed up at Grandpa's house with Denise and my aunt, all three of them stepping out of the SUV like they were arriving to check on him. But I saw the real purpose in their posture. They weren't here to see Grandpa. They were here to be seen. Dad rang the doorbell twice like he owned the place, and when I opened it, he smiled this careful, performative smile and said, "Chelsea, we just want to make sure Dad's okay." And Denise chimed in, "We've been worried sick." And I almost asked, worried enough to come for his birthday, but I didn't, because Grandpa had taught me something in the last few weeks. Sometimes the strongest move is letting them talk long enough to expose themselves. Grandpa called from the living room, "I'm in here." And Dad walked in like he was the injured party, like he was the one who'd been abandoned, and he started with a soft voice. "Dad, people are saying you changed your will, and that's not like you, and we just want to protect you." And Grandpa said, "Protect me from what?" And Dad hesitated for half a second too long, the kind of hesitation that reveals the script. And then he said, "From being taken advantage of." And Grandpa stared at him and said, "Then start with the people who took $50,000 and never repaid it." And Dad's face tightened, because there it was, the receipt, the one thing manipulators can't stand: memory. Denise jumped in fast. "Walter, that was family, that was years ago, we're talking about now." And Grandpa said, "Now is when you finally show up because you got a letter." And my aunt snapped, "This is not the time for accusations." And Grandpa said, "Then why did you bring an audience?" And Dad's eyes flicked to me like I was the problem, like I was the contaminant. Then he tried the guilt punch, the old reliable. "Dad, after all we've done, you're going to leave everything to her." And Grandpa didn't even blink. He said, "You mean after all I've done?" And the room went tight. Denise stepped closer to Grandpa, voice syrupy. "Walter, sweetie, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly." And Grandpa's eyes sharpened. "Don't sweetie me," he said, and it was the first time I'd ever heard him use that tone. Not angry, just final, like a door closing. Dad turned to me, and here came the real move, the one aimed to make me react. "Chelsea, if you cared about him, you'd let him see his family without poisoning him." And I felt my hands clench, because that sentence was evil in a very specific way. It reverses reality. It frames the person doing the work as the villain and the person doing the harm as the victim. And if you've ever lived with gaslighting, you know that feeling, like your brain is being asked to betray your own eyes. I said calmly, "He can see whoever he wants." And Grandpa said immediately, "I don't want." And Dad cut him off. "Dad, you don't mean that." And Grandpa leaned forward and said, "I mean it more than I've meant anything in years." And then he did something that made Dad pale. Grandpa reached to the side table, picked up Martin Keller's card, held it between two fingers, and said, "My attorney told me if you came here and tried to pressure me, I should tell you one thing." And Dad swallowed. "What?" And Grandpa said, "Stop, or the next call is to the court." And Dad's smile fell apart like cheap paper. Denise tried to recover. "Nobody's pressuring anybody." And Grandpa said, "Then leave." And my aunt scoffed, "You can't just kick family out." And Grandpa looked her dead in the eye. "Watch me." And I swear to you, in that moment, he didn't look weak at all. He looked like a man remembering he was allowed to own his life. Dad's voice rose, sharp now, mask off. "This is insane." And Grandpa said, "No, this is consequence." And Dad turned toward me again. "You're doing this." And I said, "No, you did this when you chose a bar over him." And Denise hissed, "How dare you?" And Grandpa said, "She can dare because she showed up." Dad took one step closer to Grandpa like he was going to intimidate him, and I shifted my body without thinking, not aggressive, just present, and Dad noticed, and that's when his eyes changed, because he realized he didn't have the physical advantage here. He didn't have the moral advantage, and he didn't have the paper advantage either. He backed off, straightened his jacket, and pulled the last card, the threat disguised as concern. "Fine," he said. "If you're going to make decisions like this, we may need to have you evaluated. For your own safety." And Grandpa's mouth tightened and he said, "You mean for your control?" And Dad snapped, "We'll see what a judge says." And then he turned and walked out like he was storming off a stage. Denise lingered half a second, leaned toward me and whispered, "This is going to get ugly." And I whispered back, "It already is," and she left. The second their car pulled away, Grandpa exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour, and he said, "They're going to file." And I said, "I know." And he looked at me with that steady, tired softness and said, "Promise me you won't let them turn this into a circus." And I said, "We'll keep it clean." And he nodded, and then my phone buzzed again. And when I looked down, it was an email notification from Martin Keller with a subject line that made my stomach drop. "Emergency. Petition. Filed." And beneath it, one sentence, "Your father just filed for temporary guardianship." And I looked up at Grandpa, and he was already watching my face, and he said, "So this is the part where they try to take my life while I'm still living." And before I could answer, the doorbell rang again, not a casual ring, a firm, official one, and through the glass I saw a man holding papers and a badge clipped to his belt. And I realized my parents hadn't just opened the front door. They were trying to drag Grandpa through it. The man at the door wasn't a cop, not exactly, but he carried himself like someone used to people obeying paperwork, a process server with a badge-style clip and that neutral face that says, "Don't shoot the messenger, but your life is about to get messy." He asked, "Walter Carter?" And Grandpa didn't flinch. He leaned forward in his recliner and said, "That's me." And the man glanced at me like I might try something dramatic. Then he held out the packet with 2 fingers and said, "You've been served." And just like that, my parents turned Grandpa's living room into a courtroom waiting room. I took the papers because Grandpa's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the kind of adrenaline you get when your own kid tries to legally rewrite your autonomy. And the top page screamed petition for temporary guardianship, and right underneath it my father's name, like a signature on betrayal. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even swear. I just felt this cold click behind my ribs. The moment you realize you're not dealing with a family argument anymore, you're dealing with a hostile takeover. Grandpa said quietly, "So they're officially calling me incompetent." And I forced my voice steady. "They're trying to." And he nodded once and said, "For money." And that sentence landed like a cinder block because it wasn't even a question. The process server looked uncomfortable, shifted his weight, then said, "There's a hearing date requested. You'll be notified." And he left, and the door closed, and the house felt too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath. I walked to the kitchen, set the packet on the counter, and my hands started shaking, not the dramatic kind, the angry kind, the kind where your body wants to punch a hole through something but your mind is doing math. Grandpa followed me slowly, one hand on the wall, and he said, "Read it out loud." So I did, because hiding the poison doesn't make it less poisonous. The petition said my father was concerned about Grandpa's capacity, and it referenced his medications, his episodes of forgetfulness, and it claimed that a third party, meaning me, had isolated him from family and influenced financial decisions. I laughed once, sharp and ugly, because imagine skipping an old man's birthday for free drinks and then accusing the person who brought him cake of isolation. Grandpa sat down at the table, his jaw tight, and he said, "They use my pills as a weapon." And I said, "They're using your age." And he looked at me and said, "They're using love like a leash." And for a second I couldn't speak because that's exactly what it is, a leash, our family rope that only pulls one direction. I called Martin Keller back immediately and put him on speaker, and Martin didn't sound surprised. He sounded annoyed, like he'd already predicted the play. "Okay," he said, "this is the escalation. Your father wants a temporary order so he can freeze accounts and intimidate Walter into undoing the trust. We respond fast and clean." Grandpa leaned toward the phone and said, "Can my son do this?" And Martin said, "He can file. Winning is different." And then Martin started listing the steps like he was building a wall brick by brick. We need a medical capacity evaluation from a neutral doctor. We need witness statements from neighbors and caregivers. We need the video we recorded. We need a timeline that shows the only time they appeared was when they lost beneficiary status. We need proof of their financial dependence on Walter and proof of their absence when he needed care. Then Martin said something that made my stomach tighten again. "They may try to show up with police for a welfare check. Do not let them bait you into an argument. Keep every interaction calm. Document everything." Grandpa let out a slow breath and said, "So they're going to parade me around like a confused child." And Martin answered, "Only if we let them control the frame." And that word frame hit me, because my parents have always been obsessed with the frame, not the truth. That night, I didn't sleep in the guest room. I slept on the couch in the living room, shoes by the door, phone on full volume, because I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd come back with another surprise, another paper, another lie dressed up as concern. Around 2:11 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from my brother, Ryan, the one who hadn't even bothered to show for Grandpa's birthday but suddenly found his thumbs when the money got threatened. "Sis, you're going too far. Dad says Grandpa's not well, and you're controlling him. Just stop before this gets ugly. I stared at the message so long my eyes burned, because the audacity of calling a cake control and calling a court petition protection is the kind of upside-down logic that makes you question humanity. I typed back one sentence. Where were you when he blew out his candles alone? And then I put my phone down because arguing with people who benefit from your silence is like debating a thief while he's holding your wallet. In the morning, Grandpa was already awake, sitting in his recliner staring at the window like he was waiting for something to fall from the sky. I made coffee black the way he liked it and put his pills in the organizer, and he watched me for a long moment and said, "They're going to try to make you look like the villain." And I said, "I don't care what they call me." And he said, "You should, because villains get punished." And then he reached out and gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "So we're going to outdocument them?" And I nodded, because if there's one thing manipulators hate, it's a paper trail. We spent that day doing things that sound boring but are actually warfare. I printed out the bar opening posts, the captions, the timestamps, the comments, the fact that they were laughing under neon lights while Grandpa was cutting cake with shaking hands. I pulled the old loan documents Grandpa had kept, the $50,000 check copy to my father, the notes about missed repayments. I pulled the roof invoices Grandpa paid for my aunt. I opened a folder on my laptop called Truth and started saving. Everything like a prosecutor building a case. Then we went next door to Mrs. Dwyer, the neighbor who'd brought Grandpa soup twice last winter, and I asked her if she'd write a statement about who she sees coming and going. She didn't hesitate. She said, "Honey, your family hasn't been here in months. You're the one I see. They're the ones who show up when they want something." She signed it at her kitchen table like she was signing a confession. Then Mr. Hernandez across the street did the same. He said, "I see you taking him to appointments. I've never seen your dad here except that one day they stormed in." Every statement felt like someone placing a brick in my chest, not heavy, steady, the kind of weight that holds you upright. That afternoon, Dad called, of course he did, and he didn't start with Grandpa's health, he started with control. "Chelsea," he said, "this has gotten out of hand. We can settle this privately if you're willing to be reasonable." I said, "Define reasonable," and he paused, just a breath, then said, "Reverse the changes. Put things back the way they were. We'll drop the petition." There it was, the real motive, clean as daylight. I said, "So you filed guardianship to force him to give you the estate," and he snapped, "Don't twist my words." I said, "I'm not twisting anything. You just offered a trade. Money for peace." He raised his voice, "He's our father." And I said, "Then act like it." He tried the guilt again. "You're destroying this family." And I said, "You destroyed it the day you chose cocktails over his birthday." And then he went silent for a second, and I heard Denise in the background whispering like a coach, and Dad came back with a different tone, syrupy. Okay. Put your grandfather on the phone. I want to hear him say, he wants this." I looked at Grandpa, and Grandpa shook his head slowly and mouthed, "No," so I said, "He's not available." And Dad exploded. "See, that right there? That's you controlling him." Grandpa stood up then, slow but determined, walked over, and took the phone out of my hand and put it on speaker himself. "Daniel," he said, voice calm, "I am here. I am listening. And I am not changing a thing." Dad tried to soften. "Dad, come on. You don't mean that." And Grandpa said, "I mean it so much I'm willing to go to court to keep it." Dad's voice turned hard. "Then we'll see you there." And Grandpa said, "Bring your receipts," and hung up. And I swear, for the first time, I saw something in Grandpa's face that I hadn't seen since his birthday. Not sadness, not disappointment, but a kind of dignity that had been waiting under the fatigue. That evening, Martin called back with an update. "They requested an emergency hearing," he said, "which means they're trying to get in front of a judge fast before we file our response." Grandpa rubbed his temples and said, "They want to catch us off balance," and Martin said, "Exactly." And then Martin added, "Also, be prepared. They may show up with a wellness check within 24 hours, and they may try to provoke Walter into looking confused or angry on camera." I looked at Grandpa and he said, "So they want me to perform?" And I said, "Then we don't give them a show. We give them facts." And right as I said that, My phone buzzed again with an unfamiliar number, and when I opened the text, my blood went cold because it was a photo, a blurry shot taken from a car down the street, of Grandpa sitting in his recliner by the window, and beneath it one line, "We're watching. See you soon." I stared at that text like it had teeth, because it wasn't just creepy, it was calculated, and the worst part was how familiar that move felt. My parents couldn't control the money anymore, so they tried to control the fear. I didn't reply, I didn't even delete it, I screenshotted it, saved it in the truth folder, and then I did the one thing people don't expect when they're trying to intimidate you. I got organized. I walked straight to Grandpa, showed him the photo, and watched his shoulders rise like he was about to apologize for being old in his own house, and I cut that off immediately by saying, "This is not your fault. This is them. And we're not hiding." Grandpa's jaw tightened and he surprised me by saying, "Good. Because if they're watching, they're going to watch me stand up." I called Martin Keller back and he didn't do drama, he did strategy. That's harassment. Save it. Do not engage. Tomorrow morning we file an emergency motion for protective order and we request the judge to consider it with the guardianship petition. Also, I want Walter evaluated by an independent physician within 48 hours. Neutral, documented, clean. Then he paused and said, "And Chelsea, your father is going to try to paint you as unstable. You need to be calm even when you're boiling." I laughed once, not funny, more like disbelief, and I said, "So, I'm supposed to be polite while they stalk my grandfather?" Martin replied, "You're supposed to be unshakable while they self-destruct. Let them be the circus. You be the record." That night we didn't turn the lights off like usual. I left the porch light on and the hallway light on and the lamp by Grandpa's recliner on, not because I was scared, but because I wanted the house to look awake, like you're not sneaking up on anyone here. Grandpa sat with a blanket over his knees and watched the late news with the volume low, and every few minutes he'd glance at the window like he expected to see my father's SUV idling at the curb. Around 11:40 p.m., the doorbell rang once, short and sharp, and my stomach dropped into my shoes. But when I opened the door, it was just Officer Lane and another officer behind him, both respectful, both already tired of being used as props. Officer Lane said, "Evening, ma'am. We received a call requesting a welfare check. Mind if we speak with Mr. Carter?" I stepped aside immediately because the way you win these games is you don't act like you're hiding anything. Grandpa called from his chair, voice steady. "I'm right here, officer." Lane walked in, glanced around, and spoke gently. "Mr. Carter, are you okay tonight?" Grandpa answered like a man who'd lived 8 decades and didn't owe anyone a performance. "I'm fine. I'm at home. I'm watching TV. My granddaughter's here helping me with meals and medication. Whoever called you is upset because they're not getting what they want." The second officer tried to keep a straight face. Lane nodded and asked a few routine questions, not to trap him, but to document the truth, and Grandpa answered each one without rushing. Then Lane looked at me and said quietly, "Ma'am, if you're receiving threatening texts, you need to file a report." I said, "I have screenshots," and I handed him my phone. He studied the message, the photo, the number, and his expression changed from neutral to serious, and he said, "We'll note this. If it escalates, call us immediately." Then Grandpa said something that I'll never forget, calm but firm. "Officer, my son is trying to use the law as a crowbar. I'd like that written down." Lane nodded again and said, "Understood." When they left, Grandpa exhaled like he'd been holding air in his chest for years, and he said, "They sent police to my house." And I said, "They tried to," and he corrected me, "No, they did. They crossed that line." The next morning, we moved like we had a schedule because we did. First stop was the clinic for the independent evaluation. Grandpa wore a simple sweater, his best "I'm not confused" outfit, and as we drove he said, "I hate that I have to prove I'm still me." And I said, "I know. But once it's on paper, their whole story collapses." The doctor was straightforward, asked Grandpa the date, where he was, who the president was, what medications he takes, what his daily routine looks like, and Grandpa answered with that dry humor that makes you want to cry and laugh at the same time, "Doc, I'm old, not gone." The doctor smiled and said, "That's a good way to put it." After a short cognitive screen, the doctor looked at me and said, "He's oriented, coherent, and making decisions consistently. I'll write it clearly." We walked out with a printed summary and the promise of a formal letter by end of day, and that paper felt like armor. Now listen, quick pause, because I want to hear from you, and I mean it. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Drop your city and your local time in the comments, because these stories hit different depending on where you're sitting when you hear them, and I read those comments because they tell me exactly what kind of family battles people are fighting quietly. And right here, since you're still with us, I've got to say it straight. Most of our viewers watch and never subscribe, and that's fine, but if you want more stories like this and you want to be part of the community that actually shows up, kindly join our community by subscribing right now. Thank you, alright. And now let's keep going, because this is where my parents got sloppy. The hearing was scheduled fast, too fast, which meant my father thought speed would scare us into folding. Martin met us outside the courthouse. Crisp suit, calm face, carrying a folder thick enough to make a statement without saying a word. My father arrived 10 minutes later, like he was walking into a board meeting, not a family disaster. Denise was with him, lipstick perfect, eyes scanning the hallway like she was searching for an audience. My brother Ryan trailed behind, hands in his pockets, not guilty enough to leave, not brave enough to look Grandpa in the eyes. And then my Aunt Nora showed up, arms crossed, already wearing the expression of someone who had decided the villain and didn't care about facts. My father stepped forward and said softly, "Dad, you don't have to do this," like he was offering Grandpa mercy, and Grandpa looked at him and said, "You already did it. You filed paperwork calling me incompetent. Don't act gentle now." Denise tried to cut in, "Walter, we're worried about you." And Grandpa said, "No, you're not. You're worried about what you're losing." That sentence made Ryan flinch, and I saw the tiniest crack in his mask, like somewhere in there he remembered the man who taught him how to ride a bike, and it almost made me feel sorry for him, almost. We went into the courtroom, and the judge, Judge Harmon, had that no-nonsense face that says she's seen every flavor of family greed. My father's attorney started with the performance. "Your Honor, we are deeply concerned that Mr. Carter is being influenced and isolated by his granddaughter, and we believe he is vulnerable to financial manipulation." And I watched my father nod like he was agreeing with the weather report. Then they presented their evidence, which was embarrassing. A list of Grandpa's medications, a note about him forgetting a doctor appointment once, and a photo of me pushing his grocery cart, like helping someone shop is suspicious now. Judge Harmon turned to Grandpa and asked, "Mr. Carter, do you understand why we're here?" Grandpa said, "Yes, ma'am. Because my son wants my property, and he thinks my age is his excuse." My father's attorney tried to object, and the judge held up a hand and said, "Let him speak." Martin stood next and didn't raise his voice once. He handed the judge the independent medical evaluation, the neighbor statements, the documented history of loans and financial support Grandpa had given my father and aunt, and then the finishing touch, the screenshot of the threatening text with the photo taken from the street. The judge's eyes narrowed when she saw that, and she asked, "Mr. Carter, have you been threatened?" Grandpa said, "Yes, because I made a legal decision my family didn't like." Then Judge Harmon looked at my father and asked, "Mr. Carter, did you or someone at your direction send this message?" My father's face tightened and he said, "Of course not," and Denise shook her head dramatically like she was offended by reality. The judge didn't look impressed. She asked, "Then why did you request a welfare check within hours of this message being sent?" My father hesitated, and that hesitation was loud. Martin stepped in smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a pattern. When they can't control the estate, they attempt to control the person." Judge Harmon tapped her pen once, and then she said the words that made my lungs finally fill with air. "I am denying the request for temporary guardianship. There is insufficient evidence of incapacity, and there is credible concern of harassment." My father's attorney started to protest, and the judge cut him off. "Additionally, I am ordering no contact pending further review, except through counsel, and I strongly suggest you reconsider the path you're choosing." My father's face went pale, not because he cared about Grandpa, but because he realized the judge was not his puppet. Outside the courtroom, Denise hissed at me under her breath, "You think you've won." And I leaned closer and said quietly, "No, I think Grandpa is safe. That's the only prize here." My father grabbed Ryan's arm and walked fast down the hall like a man fleeing his own reflection. Grandpa stood there for a second, shoulders squared, and he whispered, "They tried to take my mind from me." And I said, "They failed." And Martin said, "For now." On the drive home, the sky was that pale winter blue that looks calm even when everything inside you is shaking, and Grandpa kept staring out the window, silent, and then he said, "Chelsea, they're not done." And I answered, "I know, because I knew that kind of person doesn't stop when they lose, they change weapons." And right as we pulled into the driveway, I saw something on the front porch that made my stomach flip again, a small padded envelope taped to the door with no return address, and written across it in thick black marker were 4 words that didn't feel like a message. They felt like a warning. "You stole from family." That envelope sat on the porch like it had weight, like paper could bruise you, and Grandpa stared at it the way you stare at a snake you didn't invite into your yard, and for half a second my brain went stupid, because when you've lived through family betrayal, your nervous system does this thing where it expects the next hit before it happens, and then my instinct snapped back on, and I said, "Don't touch it." And then I took a photo of it exactly where it was, tape and all, because the difference between winning and losing in these situations is proof. And then I used my sleeve to peel one corner of the tape, not because I wanted to be brave, but because I wanted to be careful. And then I slipped the envelope into a clean zip bag like it was evidence from a crime scene, because at this point, it basically was. And then Grandpa surprised me again by saying, "Open it." And I looked at him and said, "Not yet." And he said, "Chelsea, I'm 81, not 12. If they're going to threaten me, I want to see it." And that's when I realized something important. They weren't just trying to scare me. They were trying to make Grandpa feel like he'd done something wrong for choosing the one person who showed up, and that kind of guilt is a poison seniors get handed like candy, and I wasn't letting that happen in this house. So we went inside. I set the envelope on the kitchen table where Grandpa used to sort his mail. I washed my hands like a surgeon, and then I opened it slowly, sliding a butter knife under the flap. So I didn't tear anything because, again, proof, and inside was one sheet of paper and a photocopy of something that made my stomach drop. A blurry copy of Grandpa's old will from years ago with my dad and Aunt Nora listed as beneficiaries, and scrawled across it in marker were the words, "This is what you owe US." Like inheritance was a debt Grandpa had to pay for the privilege of being old. Grandpa stared at it and then laughed once, not happy, more like disgusted, and he said, "They're acting like I borrowed my own life from them." And then, right on cue, my phone buzzed, and it was my brother Ryan, and his text was the kind that makes your blood heat up because it pretends to be neutral while carrying a knife. "Chelsea, Dad's freaking out. Can we talk like adults? You're tearing the family apart." I read it out loud to Grandpa, and he said, "Adults? Where were the adults on my birthday?" And I could feel myself getting pulled into that old trap, the one where you defend yourself to people who aren't listening, and then Martin Keller's words hit me, "Be the record," and I didn't respond emotionally, I responded strategically. "Ryan, any communication goes through counsel now. If you need to share something, send it in writing to Martin." And then, because I'm not made of stone, I added one line. "If you ever actually want to talk about Grandpa, you can start by visiting him." No emojis, no softness, just the truth. And then I put the phone down. That evening, Officer Lane came back to take the report. He photographed the envelope, the note, and the photocopy, and he asked Grandpa directly, "Do you feel safe, sir?" Grandpa said, "I feel safer now that I've stopped pretending they love me." That sentence hit me in the ribs because it wasn't cruel, it was clarity, and that's what people don't understand about boundaries. They're not revenge, they're reality with the fog removed. Lane explained something that matters, especially for anyone watching who's dealing with family pressure. If a person is competent, they can choose where their property goes. If someone's pressuring them, that can cross into coercion. He said it plainly, and I wanted every viewer who's ever been guilted by relatives to hear it and feel it in their bones. After the officer left, Grandpa asked for tea, and while I boiled the water, he said, "I need you to promise me something," and I said, "Name it." And he said, "Don't let this turn you into them. Don't let their greed make you mean." And I swallowed hard because my first instinct had been to go scorched earth, to humiliate, to expose, to torch every group chat and every social post they'd ever loved. and part of me still wanted that. And then I looked at Grandpa's hands, the tremor, the pill bottles lined up like little sentries, and I remembered what this was really about: time, dignity, and protection. The next day, Martin filed for a restraining order based on the harassment pattern and requested the court to designate Grandpa as a protected adult for the purpose of preventing undue influence. And then he set up something called a no-contest clause reinforcement letter, basically a formal warning that if my dad or aunt tried to challenge the trust in bad faith, they could lose any small personal items Grandpa had still planned to give them, like family photos or heirlooms, and I know that sounds petty, but people like this will burn down an entire family album just to feel like they won. Martin also had us do one more thing that I want you to remember if you're watching and you're dealing with predatory relatives. We created a weekly documentation routine. Every Sunday, same time, Grandpa and I sat at the kitchen table and we recorded a short video check-in where Grandpa said the date, the week's events, how he was feeling, and that he still stood by his decisions, and then we saved it in 2 places. It wasn't theatrical. It was protective. It was Grandpa reclaiming his voice, so no one could rewrite it later. And then, because life has a sense of timing, Ryan showed up on a Wednesday afternoon. Not Dad. Not Aunt Nora. Ryan. He stood on the porch holding a grocery bag like it was a peace offering, and he looked older than he should, like guilt had been chewing on him quietly for months. Grandpa opened the door himself, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he wanted to, and Ryan said, "Grandpa, I'm sorry," and Grandpa didn't rush to forgive him. He just said, "Come in." That moment right there was the real twist. Not money, not documents, not courtrooms, but the smallest crack in the family wall, because sometimes the only way a person wakes up is when the consequences finally get loud enough that they can't sleep through them. Ryan sat at the table, hands wrapped around his coffee, and he admitted something that made my skin prickle. "Dad's been telling everyone you tricked Grandpa. He's been calling relatives, saying you're isolating him. He's trying to get people to write statements." And then he looked at me and said, "I didn't believe him, but I didn't stop him either." Grandpa nodded slowly and said, "That's what cowards do. They don't swing the knife, they just hand it to someone else." Ryan's eyes filled and he said, "I want to make it right." And I asked him straight because I don't do vague. "Do you want to make it right, or do you want to feel better?" He flinched, then whispered, "Both." And honestly, that was the first real answer anyone in that family had given in years. Grandpa told him, "If you want to make it right, you show up when there's nothing in it for you." And Ryan nodded and said, "I will." And then he pulled out his phone and showed us something he'd saved, a voice note my dad had sent him, angry and panicked, saying, "If you don't back me up, you're out too. This is family business." And hearing my father threaten his own son to maintain control did something to me, because it wasn't just greed, it was domination, and it made the whole story click into place. My parents didn't skip Grandpa's birthday because they were busy. They skipped it because Grandpa had stopped being useful to them in the only currency they respected. Grandpa looked at the voice note, then at Ryan and said, "Keep that." And then he looked at me and said, "And you keep being you." The weeks after that didn't turn into a Hallmark movie. My dad didn't apologize. Aunt Nora didn't bake a casserole and cry in the driveway. Denise didn't suddenly grow a conscience. What happened was quieter and more real. The pressure stopped working. The calls slowed. The family loyalty speeches got less dramatic when they realized courts don't care about guilt trips. And Grandpa, instead of shrinking, got calmer, because there is a peace that comes when you stop negotiating with people who only love you when you're convenient. In late spring, Grandpa's health declined, and I moved fully into the guest room, and the final weeks weren't about revenge at all. They were about presence, about sitting beside him while the afternoon sun warmed the living room, about reading the newspaper out loud, about laughing when he roasted my cooking and then asked for seconds anyway, and one night he said softly, "Chelsea, promise me you won't waste your life proving yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you." And I promised. And then he squeezed my hand like he was sealing a contract. And then, when he passed, it wasn't with chaos around him, it was with calm, and that was the victory my parents could never steal. After the funeral, my dad tried one more time. He sent a long email about forgiveness and family, and how Grandpa would have wanted unity, and I read it and felt nothing but clarity, because the people who preach unity after death are usually the ones who refuse to show love during life. and I didn't respond. I kept Grandpa's handwritten letter, the one that said, "You didn't give me money, you gave me time," and I kept the Sunday videos, not because I needed them anymore, but because they reminded me that truth can be protected. And then I did the most important thing. I used part of the trust to set up a small scholarship fund at the local community college for students who are caregivers, because if you've ever been the one who shows up, you know you pay in exhaustion and missed opportunities, and someone should finally pay you back. So let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Did my parents cross the line the moment they chose a bar over Grandpa's birthday, or the moment they tried to take his mind in court? And if you've lived through anything like this, tell me the cleanest boundary you ever set, because somebody reading your comment needs permission to do the same. And before you go, don't click away yet, because the next story you need to watch is the one where a mother used a hospital emergency to steal a deed, and the daughter didn't find out until the bank called her at work. And when you see how that woman reversed it, you'll never look at family paperwork the same way again.